I would like to welcome Shawn Busse from Kinesis. He is the CEO and founder of a B Corp consulting firm who's going to share with us some creative ideas around evolution of business. Shawn, are you here? Oh, there you are.
Take this out. Here we go. All right. So I was here earlier. I'm sure many of you were as well. And I'm watching some great speakers. And then I'm watching the AV situation happen. And I'm just sitting there, just feeling for these folks, like, and here's the, and I'm thinking in my head, boy, that has got to be really rough. And then the second thought that's in my head is, wow, I have a deck that's probably the most visual deck you're going to see all day, and it's like 80 slides. And so I'm kind of freaking out. So I'd like to just take a minute and give a big round of applause for all of the presenters and the speakers who have given their time today, because the money in this thing is really good, but they're doing it for the love of it too, so. All right. Hello, all right. Okay. So there's a story. Many of you have heard this story. It's an old story. It's about two fish. Two young fish are swimming along in the water. They swim past this old fish, and the old fish looks down at the two young fish and says to the two young fish, "Hey boys, how's the water?" Two young fish swim on a little further, and the one young fish looks at the other young fish and goes, "What the hell is water?" And I think that's sort of the theme for a lot of today, right? It's like, what is the water we're swimming around in? What do we take for granted? It's easy to kind of interpret that story as being about age and wisdom and youth, but it's really about awareness. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the idea of what are we aware of in our business? What's the water we're swimming in? What's the water I've been swimming in and maybe not aware of? And I'll share some stories of that awareness and the future awareness that hopefully we have as we grow and develop and learn. So we've been swimming in some water for a little while, a few billion years. Looked at like how long have we been operating as groups, working together, trying to get things done as a team. That number's a pretty big number too. About, give or take, 350,000 years. We've been operating as teams, trying to get things done together, working together with purpose. In this case, the purpose is survival and making it to the next day. Call these tribal teams, this idea of limited hierarchies. So the top person on the chain and the bottom person on the chain are really not that far apart. High degree of equality, shared responsibilities, probably not job descriptions, right? Doing things for the good of the group, that there's a common purpose and what we're trying to do together is meaningful and we care about one another. Now, certainly, that's not all perfect and beautiful for 350,000 years. I mean, we're talking clubs and probably lots of violence, but the idea here is we've evolved to work together in a certain way, right? And what's interesting is when you test this out, right? So tests of primates, tests with children, where we kind of teach them the essentials of equality and fairness, right? You can actually teach primates how to trade. So like they'll give you a rock and you give them a piece of food, and they'll give you another rock and they'll know they're going to get a piece of food. And what's interesting is if you change that dynamic and you have a couple of monkeys working in this trading game. So if one monkey gives you a rock and you give it a cucumber, and you do the same thing with the next monkey, but then you change it and you give that second monkey a grape, which is really good, the first monkey gets really pissed off, right? So now, when the monkey gives you a rock and you give it a cucumber, the monkey takes the cucumber and throws it at you, literally. And if you have children, you've probably seen this in action, right? That's not fair. They've actually studied this too, and they've taught children how to do things together and work collaboratively. And when you break that foundation of fairness, you get this kind of result. Call that DNA wins. So it's like, we've been doing this for 350,000 years, and it's been relatively fair and equitable. And then when you start to break that system, really bad things happen. Happens in the workplace. We've seen this before, right? Sometimes peacefully, sometimes with violence. Happens on airplanes. So this is a really interesting study that they did where they looked at air rage, right? So air rage is probably what you think it is. It's when people get really angry on board of an airplane and kind of freak out. So what's interesting is they studied what happens when people walk through the first class section on a plane and they see this inequity right in front of them, and then they move into the coach section. How does that compare to planes where there's no first class section? And it's 4 times as likely for there to be an air rage incident when there's a first class section. So like, let that settle in for just a second, right? They're planes, right? They get us from point A to point B. What's the difference? The difference is at the first class section. So it's that inequity of the team being pushed right into our face, right? It's the monkey saying, I don't want this cucumber anymore. As soon as you take that away, everything's great. So if you look at, say, pre-industrialized tribes in the Amazon, for example, you see these ideas. You see really short hierarchical structures. You see fairness. You see, a tendency to support one another. And I wanted to get a sense of like, well, what does that look like in terms of an evolutionary scale, right? If we've been evolving as Homo sapiens for about 350,000 years, how much of that time have we behaved this way? So I created an evolutionary calendar where January 1st is 350,000 years ago, and every day is plus or minus about 10,000 years. I rounded a little bit, so for those of you really high fact finders in the room, you're gonna be like, well, that's 365,000 years, but we'll just give it a plus or minus, okay? So January 1st, beginning of the Homo sapien species, December 31st, midnight is today. So essentially 10,000 years per day. And if you walk through time, 30,000 years, 60,000 years, 90,000 years, 120,000 years, forward to 340,000 years, of time, your basically present day all happens in this last square. And what's really interesting about that idea is to kind of frame up some of these ideas for things that we take for granted, like how long they've been going on. And actually, in the span of evolution and DNA, a lot of these things haven't been going on very long at all. So let's look at when the first big thing happened, right? Midnight, December 30th. We figured out how to stop hunting and gathering together, and we started to plant things. Things changed in a big way when we started to plant things, right? Because now we had stuff we could accumulate. When you're not hunting and gathering, you can actually have grain that you can put in stores and have warehouses. So this was really the first giant kind of social evolution in those 350,000 years. And that happened really not that long ago, really 10,000 years ago, so about a day in the evolutionary calendar. And then the next big evolutionary thing that happened at 10 a.m. on December 31st. And we moved into cities, right? So about 6,000 years ago, we said, okay, we're gonna start building these things called cities. That's gonna change how things work. That's gonna change the nature of work. We're gonna go from generalists to specialists, and we're gonna actually start to become a little bit more isolated, So instead of us being part of a tribe with a collective purpose, we're now gonna have individual roles, and we're gonna work on those roles. And even still work, even though it changed fairly dramatically with the evolution of urbanization and agriculture, there's still some things about this, I think, that align with our DNA, right? So if you're a cobbler, you can still have a sense of purpose and challenge of working with materials and having relationships with the tanner. So work changed significantly, but there were still some elements of it that I think really lined up well with those evolutionary ideas. And then things really changed with like 30 minutes left to go in the evolutionary clock. So we're talking maybe 200 years. This thing, right? So industrial capitalism, right? We went from this idea of cities and making things to actually figuring out a new way of working. And the new way of working is pretty incredible. you could produce lots and lots of things. It shifted us into this idea of segmenting parts and making those parts really quickly and efficiently. And so no longer were you the cobbler who made a pair of shoes and you had a relationship with the person you sold the shoes to. You were that one person who made the eyelet on the boot. And you made eyelets, and you made eyelets, and you made eyelets, and you made eyelets. And the next person made the sole, and made the sole, and made the sole. And that change had some pretty big impact and fundamentally formed how we think about how business gets done. Now, I know a lot of you in the room are going like, that's not how I do business, and that's awesome. You know, in some ways there's a little bit of choir preaching going on here. But I think what I will surprise you with in a minute here is how much of this there is even in this room. So if you look at an engine taken apart and put into its component parts, very much of this idea of how we do business today is about separating things into parts, right? Roles and responsibilities, duties, tasks, jobs, KPIs, parts, 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 parts. And this idea is really about component thinking. And in component thinking, you know, you need management, you need direction, you optimize things, you maximize them, you measure them. These are really key ideas, right? Because if you're Henry Ford and you want to make more Model Ts, you use component thinking. And in component thinking, there's a key idea, which is this word, which is super hard to read the parenthesis below, so I'm sorry for the folks in the back, but it's a philosophy. And that philosophy is called mechanism, which is the idea that things are made of parts and that there isn't necessarily a relationship between the parts and the whole, right? And that's a little foreign. That's very weird. But we take it for granted. It's everywhere in business. And I'll show you how I thought this way and continue to think this way, even though I don't always realize it. Part of the reason mechanism is so powerful is it's really effective. Right? So mechanism helped us do things like fly to the moon. It helped us reduce infant mortality. It helped us produce a lot of food. It helped us create cars. It helped us create iPhones. It made, you know, YouTube videos with angry cats. So there's a lot that mechanism has created that is amazing. You know, frankly, you know, in many ways, I took my phone out before I got up here because I'm like, I'm going to eliminate all potential sources of AV problems. So I took the phone out. But in many ways, right, those phones are like a piece of magic in your pocket. You know, you can know things, you can learn things, you can communicate with people far away. Great stuff. Okay. Now, when I show these old photos, what's cool about the old photos is you can see mechanism everywhere, right? You can see mechanism in the way the floor is laid out. You can see mechanism in the way the toolboxes are set up. You can do it in the white-collar space, too. You can see these sort of mechanistic thinking around how desks are organized. If you look at a cube farm in a corporate office space, right, that's a very mechanistic way of thinking of organizing people. It's also in areas that are less obvious. Right? So here's an organizational chart that I just picked off of somewhere. And you know, these things get massive when you start talking about large corporations. But the idea, right, mechanism is separating things into their component parts. And I realized, wow, I've created org charts for Kinesis. Many of them. Some of them way too complicated. And really the hidden peril here is that effectively we are beginning to think about people as part of a machine. And when we start to think about people as part of a machine, it shifts our language and it shifts our relationships to one another. So I thought, well, let's give some examples of that are in use every day in business, things that I've used over and over again. Many of you probably use these ideas, right? So, you know, instead of relationships to one another, we have words like performance. Annual performance review, performance improvement plan. Wow, his performance is amazing. Her performance really needs to get better. Da 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 da. Right? Performance, it's a term that's associated, right, with engines and machines and things and how well they're working. And yet we start to move them into the world of humans. Less obvious examples, right? In the world of mechanism, it's all about things that are produced. And so even though we live in a world that's about ideas today and strategies, we have words that get created like this, right? Oh my God, that's an amazing idea. Put it into a report, and then we'll have a deliverable, right? So those of you who work in kind of service-based businesses, right, that's always the word, right? Deliverable, deliverable, deliverable. It's like, I started thinking about this. I'm like, you know, I have a dream. Where's the deliverable? That's a terrible idea to say, I have a deliverable for that, right? E equals MC squared, what's the deliverable for that? Really great ideas are not about deliverables, right? They're about great ideas. You'll all recognize this one, right? Move the needle, right? Needles are gauges used to measure machines' performance. Ways of thinking, right? So what do, right? We dig coal out of the ground, we cut trees down, we take stuff off the earth and we use it for however we want, right? So resource extraction. Wow, we have a whole department named after resources. So you just think about these ideas and like, where do they come from? You know, we take them for granted. You know, I have an old organizational chart. There's the HR department. Never thought about it. You get to some of the things like HR's evil cousin, human capital. That's a term you see and use too. Saw a report the other day. It was so ironically titled something like, "The State of the Workplace, Building a More Human Business, Human Capital, and How We Can Do Better." And I was just like, Jesus Christ, you know? Like, what is that about? And so the thought, like, how do we begin thinking? Now, I know that a lot of us are associating these ideas and these ways of behaving and these thought processes with this kind of environment. You know, I have a company of 13 people or so. Many of you have companies just like that, smaller, larger, but very rarely is it this type of person is in this room. But I want to show you all the journey I have come to with Mechanism and this thinking of like, what is the water in our organization? Because in many ways, I've been using the tools of Mechanism to build on its outward layer, a very, very successful business. So, you know, I said, hey, let's get a group of people together, let's build a cool business, and let's do things differently. So this was before I joined the B Corp community. I even knew what B Corp was. I had just worked for awful employers in the past, and I thought, well, why don't we treat people well and see what happens, right? So, like, there's a crazy idea. So, turns out, you treat people well. The metrics you want to use to gauge success, or are normally used to gauge success, we're all like pointing in the right direction, right? Fastest growing company, 5 years in a row, you know, producing good profitability, great customer retention, great employee retention, you know, doing things that were not only fun, but, you know, engaging and celebratory, even crazy stuff like, you know, saying to everybody on the team, hey, we're going to jump out of an airplane, and I hope that's okay with you, and let's see what happens. And everybody landed okay. If you really want a transformative experience, I don't recommend doing that. In hindsight, saying we're just going to jump out of an airplane is not the best. So anyway, this is a great company. You know, I mean, Kinesis is awesome, filled with wonderful people, great people, people doing good work with meaningful clients. And even with all of that, you know, I've suddenly realized, like, there's hidden mechanism even through that space, even in a space where I want to lead with culture and people. So getting back to this idea of what makes a great team, I started looking at the entire organization, and I started finding this stuff everywhere. I'll show you just two examples, right, of where I was really at odds with this idea of creating, you know, limited hierarchy and equality and shared responsibilities and common purpose. So we're really good at hiring at Kinesis, and I know that because we have low turnover. I know that because we get crazy scores on employee engagement. I know that because the clients are happy. And so when you go to hire somebody, what do you want, right? You don't ever like put in the job description, yeah, we're looking for somebody mediocre, right? Bring me somebody that's like, meh, right? No. We want, if I'm setting up a basketball team, we want this guy. Right, you want LeBron on your team. You want the best. And so we would use this kind of language, right, in our job descriptions. You know, we hire the best of the best. We're putting together an all-star team. In other industries, you'll hear language like, oh, I need a code ninja, right? Or I need a rock star XYZ, right? You start to slip in this language of superior athletes, right? And yeah, we really want to hire great people. But actually, there's something interesting that happens when you start to get this tunnel vision around building a team of top performers. So they've studied this actually in the NBA for about a decade, and they started to notice that as the team, for those of you in the back who can't see, as the team started to get quote unquote top talent, and it got to as high as 80%, their actually number of games won starts to plummet. So their performance with 80% top talent matches their performance at 20% top talent. And what's crazy about that is it's not just the NBA. You get this same curve when you look at soccer. You get this same curve when you start to even look at white-collar jobs and how you staff them. And there's a number of reasons for that. You know, one is that sometimes when you hire all-stars, there's a competition for who the leader is. But there's another factor in this, which is we often measure what makes an all-star through a lens that's very narrow, right? Oh man, they're a great producer. Let's hire more of those producers. But what about somebody who comes into a team, and when they come into a team, everybody's happier and lighter? How do you measure that? Like, what's the KPI for this person makes teams amazing? It's not measured, right? So often when we're looking for all-stars, we're measuring along a dimension that's not well understood in terms of how it influences the team and the dimensions that we don't know. One more that snuck into Kinesis, it sneaks in. I still have to catch myself when I say this. I grabbed a little French chateau here. People are your most important asset. And anybody here ever said that before? I mean, come on, you can admit it. Like, say it all the time, right? And I get it, right? The motivation behind it is pure. The motivation is to say, look, of all the stuff we have, the machines and the buildings and finances and bank accounts, people are the thing, right? Without people, everything else is subordinate and not critical. The problem, though, is we are continuing to borrow from the language of mechanism, right? And so I started to look into the word asset, you know, aside from having the word ass in it. It's actually, it's a 16th century French word that means enough, meaning you've got enough stuff to discharge a will, right? So its root is in stuff, and we use it regarding stuff all the time. You know, what's the value of your assets? You know, how many assets does he have? Blah, 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 blah. So when we combine these words together, right, you know, employees are your most important asset. Even though you're elevating them here, you're still using the language of things. So I like these photos in that they make mechanism very obvious, and you can see it in action, whether it's in, you know, a corporate space or a manufacturing space. But I find it fascinating how mechanism is everywhere, even in great companies, even in companies that put people at the top of their purpose. So things like, you know, digital products that help manage employees and their performance and assigning KPIs for employees, like how is that employee producing and how is their performance? What's their level of engagement? Let's measure it with a net promoter score. Things like best places to work, right? Where we're measuring. Now, I'm not saying don't measure stuff, but what I'm saying is that that is a way of thinking that's massively informed by mechanism, and that the tendency here is this is what happens, right? We overvalue things that are measurable. We overvalue those metrics. And then we start to build teams of all-stars, and we don't realize, wow, this all-star team is actually underperforming, and it doesn't make any sense because we don't know the things, and we don't know how to measure the things that often really, really matter. And these are the human things, right? These are the things that for like 340,000 years have made us successful as teams. And what I mean by that is these are the immeasurable things, right? Things like a sense of purpose, a sense of family, a sense of commitment to one another, right? Things that often we apply to our personal world, right? One of my favorite questions is to say, well, what's the KPI around the success of your marriage? Right? Or go have a performance review with your children. Like, you would never say those things, right? Because the things that those relationships produce, the quality of those relationships, they're ineffable, but they're so powerful and important. And we're hesitant to bring them into the workplace. Other examples of things that, you know, I don't think are easily measured, right? The idea of like the joy of shared success. There's not a metric for that. And there probably shouldn't be a metric for that. And if it doesn't exist in your organization, that's a problem. How about the journey, right? Oh, I've climbed 6 of the world's highest mountains. That's what the media publishes. But the media doesn't publish, the sense of joy I had from being with my colleagues on that journey was something like I've never felt before. That doesn't get a headline, right? But yet, for those of us who know the joy of the journey, it's way more important than reaching the top of the mountain, right? Honestly, this is like my favorite photo ever, which is like the photo between the photos that end up, on the professional websites and all that sort of stuff. It's like, oh, we're professional and stuff. Like, we were just totally dorking off. I don't even know what happened, but, I call that like the moments between the moments. The moments that we're not paying attention to. Those are the things that make for great culture. So I want to give you 2 things to think about as ways to maybe move beyond the idea of culture, or maybe beyond the idea of, hey, we're in water. I think most of us here recognize that the business space is water. Let's make the water better, right? Well, how about we look at maybe other ways to think beyond even the water itself? So I give you 2 examples. One is here in this audience, and I want to give him a big thank you for letting me use his idea. I don't actually have that many good ideas. I just find other people's good ideas. So Devin Paolo of Solid Form, on the surface, owns a steel fabrication company out in McMinnville. But the truth is, he has a company that creates community. And he has a company that creates economic prosperity and opportunity for those in the community with apprenticeship programs, with training programs, with reinventing the way work can get done and people can move into the workforce. So, and he also has really awesome tattoos. So this is the kind of work that is often done at Solid Form. I love that he's thinking about his organizational chart like a circle. Right? And the center of the circle of his organizational chart is the vision and purpose of the organization. That's our, what we stand for. And much like a tree, which starts off small and weak, it grows with time, and that center grows stronger and stronger. And then it's the job of leaders in the organization to communicate that purpose and that sense of why and what we're all doing here. That's the leadership's job. Then the next ring there out is the how we get the work done, right? These are so important, right? These are the folks who figure out how to take that vision and turn it into something in the organization. The word he wrote down was implementers, which I really love, way better than the idea of middle management, right? These are the folks who are there to make the vision real and to articulate with leadership and with those who are doing the work, which gets us to the what. The mentors, the practitioners, the learners. I have to keep looking at this slide because I was introduced to this idea like 2 weeks ago, and I'm like, this is the thing right here, right? Like, the organizational chart is a tree. And the center of the tree, even though, it gets further and further from the outside, that is the essence of what the organization stands for. But without the outside of the tree, the organization cannot thrive, right? Even to the idea that the nutrients to the tree travel up the outside of the tree. That's where the rest of the world interfaces with the tree. So there's this idea of things moving from the outside in, right? So if somebody comes into the organization as an apprentice, they're working towards the idea of vision and purpose instead of climbing a ladder, filling in boxes along the way. Now, this is a work in progress here. I think Devin's got lots of scribbles, but I think that fundamental idea, like, that's a great conversation to have. Like, maybe organizational charts don't need to be boxes. If you think about how we behave when we're in our natural state, right? If I were to set up a campfire out there, we wouldn't gather around the campfire in a grid, right? We wouldn't set up little boxes and be like, okay, your job description is to be in this box here. That's your role. Your job is to be a little closer with the marshmallows. That's your role. No, we'd gather around the campfire in a ring, right? We would form a circle. You think about, tribes and how they set up their societies. They put things in a circle, right? Even pioneers, right? Circle the wagons, right? It's a natural human behavior, and yet it's rarely ever seen in an organization. So one more idea. And hopefully this will get you excited as well as ways you can bring these ideas into your organization. So when you walk into our company, when you walk into Kinesis, this is the first thing you see, right? This grid of photos, all the team members that work at Kinesis and contribute to Kinesis and make Kinesis what it is. And these aren't like professional headshots, with our little suits and ties and stuff like that. These are photos of what Kinesians do, that they're passionate about. And it's the first thing you see. The first thing you see when you come into Kinesis isn't like, oh, look, here's our work, and here's some samples, and our client testimonials, and blah, 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 right? We want this up front to say it's about the people here, but it's about the whole person, right? It's about the things that they do outside of the business. They're just as important as the things they do inside the business, and I want to hire a whole person. That term that came into popularity a while ago, work-life balance. I actually hate that term. I think that term is a reaction against the frustration of work demanding people to give their souls to an organization and trying to create some sense of self and humanity. And I'm saying, like, work, life, it's everything, right? Everything is the whole human. And let's celebrate that and take advantage of those things. So whether it's Alana and her cooking, or it's Allie and her snowboarding, or Jeff, and God bless him, he makes lightsabers. And that's freaking amazing, right? The guy makes lightsabers. Oh, and on Tuesday nights, he goes and battles with them. That's passion for a thing, right? And the fact that he knows I'm showing this slide and he has I'm not embarrassed about that. That's freaking great. I'm like, hell yeah, that's awesome. And I go into work and I'm like, hey, what'd you do with your lightsabers this weekend? And I'm interested, oh, well, maybe we could use my milling machine and we could make this thing for your lightsaber and blah, blah, blah. I care about the whole person, right? And what's crazy is that all those slides I showed you earlier where we were growing fast and accomplishing great things according to sort of third parties saying we're doing good things, so many of those things were driven not by this, but they were driven by things like productivity and utilization and hitting measurable goals and making sure every goal was quantifiable. I'm not saying I know I'm being a little sarcastic. I'm not saying that stuff is terrible, but I'm saying that if that's all you do and you miss the humanity, you're missing out on so much. So here's how we take the idea of humanity and turn it into a business process. So I know many of you have been part of performance reviews or annual performance reviews or maybe one-on-one performance reviews. I hate the idea of performance reviews. You know why? The word performance, mechanism, blah, blah, blah. So I think a lot of companies now are shifting away from this idea of once a year, let's make everybody anxious and maybe I'll get a raise, maybe I won't, and I'll be reviewed, to let's have conversations on an ongoing basis. So a lot of folks have shifted to that model, which I think is a far more human idea, right? Conversations are human. Annual performance reviews are weird. So let's make things more frequent. And then instead of things like, did you hit your 38% utilization rate, or did you hit your productivity goal of $150,000? Let's actually ask the employees to ask questions. And so what I mean by that is that when we work with employees to move them on a journey of transformation, we're putting the challenge to them. We're saying to them, okay, how do I energize the team, right? We're a team. How do I bring that goodness into the organization each and every day? I'm not going to tell them how to energize the team. They're going to tell me how they do it, right? Because they're adults, and I get to treat them like adults, and that's the best thing ever, right? And the ideas you get out of this by asking them to answer their questions, far more remarkable than anything I could ever come up with. So building a great team starts with energizing that team and asking folks how they do that. How do I create great work? As much as, I was laughing at deliverables, we have to produce things for people to buy, to give us money, to be part of the machine. But let's make it great. Let's have it be purpose-filled. So how do we do that? So tell me. I don't know. What's the answer? And then lastly, I call this sort of the tripod. how do I foster resilience? So how do I create a company that's sustainable now and into the future? A big part of that, like for our organization, is open book financials. A big part of that is transparent communication, flat hierarchy, supportive models that can, offset things that are difficult. So a lot of the structure of the company is designed to be resilient. But then how do the employees bring even more of that into the organization? How do we as a team become a resilient force? All right, so I could talk on this all day. I love this stuff. I'm going to just leave you with one last thought, okay? So when I started this story, I talked about the fish in the water and breathing the water. And I think the first step of that evolution is realizing that we're in the water. And there's businesses all over the place out there that they don't even know they're fish, let alone that they're swimming in the water. So all of us can go out there and help people see that there's water and what it looks like. That's the beginning. But then for a lot of you who know we're in this water and what that water looks like, I know a lot of you are actually making that water way, 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 way better, right? You're saying, hey, if we're going to be in the water, let's make this great water. That's culture, that's treating people well, that's being transparent, that's diversity, that's equity, that's inclusion, all of these things. In many ways, the B Corp community is about making the water really amazing. I want to challenge you and say that the water is awesome, but we can actually consider getting out of the water. That we can actually go out of the water and start to breathe air, right? And that's a new world. Who knows what that looks like? Maybe that's a world with a round organizational chart. Maybe that's a world where there aren't performance reviews, there's just better questions, right? So now we're breathing oxygen and we've evolved to a new state that's awkward and uncomfortable and there aren't rules for it and I don't have the playbook here, I'm figuring it out like you. But if we can start to breathe air, we can go up on land, right? And if we can go up on land, we can start to crawl around and it's kind of awkward and we might have a tail for a little while and eventually that's going to fall off. And if we're crawling around, we could actually start to walk. And if we're walking, now maybe we're walking upright. And then if we're walking upright, now we're running. And if we're running, maybe we can fly. Thank you so much.